thank you to the New York Historical Society. Welcome, everybody. It's great to see so many friends, so many familiar faces, and so many friends of The Economist. So I'm thrilled that you're here. This is our first in-person subscriber event. We have, as you know, been running subscriber webinars now for almost 2 years, but this is our first in-person event. It's part of a full series, and if you like it, if we like it, I hope it's something that we do more of. Our subject this evening, the new geopolitics, frankly, could not be more timely or more important. The world's geopolitical order, for want of a sort of grand phrase, is being rocked by a number of shocks, but two, I think, that we will focus on tonight, two really, really important ones. The first is the state of the US-Sino relationship, which is at its worst, I think, in 50 years, in half a century. Henry Kissinger, whom I interviewed for more than 8 hours earlier this year, said that we were on a path to great power confrontation. I was in Beijing earlier this year, as David will remember, and I left there thinking that if we get through the next decade without full-on military confrontation, we will have achieved something. It's really a terrible relationship right now. Secondly, of course, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, 2022, changed not only Europe, but the geopolitical order as well. It transformed the transatlantic alliance, I think in some ways brought the transatlantic alliance much closer, but it also exposed a rift between the West, if you will, and the rest. And it is worth remembering that 3/4 of the world's population lives in countries that are either neutral on Ukraine or actually support Russia. So the West may be closer, but the rest of the world is not necessarily there. One of the big shocks we've seen in the past 18 months has been the rise in importance of what you might call the rest, whether it's India, whether it's Saudi Arabia. It's geopolitical actors playing an increasing role, taking advantage of their position and the US-Sino tensions to carve out a much greater role for themselves. And all of this is happening against the backdrop of the US election of 2024, which I'm sure you too are watching with some trepidation, but we and the rest of the world are watching with real trepidation. So that is the canvas that I hope we're going to talk about in the next few minutes. And I've got 3 terrific colleagues to do this, who for the first time are meeting IRL, as my kids would say, in real life. David Rennie, on your right-hand side, is our Beijing bureau chief and the author of our Chaguan column. Before he went to Beijing in 2018, David spent 6 years as our Lexington columnist and Washington bureau chief. So I genuinely think you are one of a handful of people who has closely watched US politics and now Chinese politics. You went to Beijing before the pandemic. You stayed in Beijing throughout the pandemic. David did not see his wife and son for more than 2 years, something which I feel constantly guilty about. But he's been doing absolutely extraordinary journalism. He is co-host of Drum Tower, our podcast on China, which, if you haven't listened to, I definitely commend. And his co-host is Alice Su, who is our senior China correspondent based in Taipei. Alice has been with us for 18 months in Taipei when we dragged her over from the LA Times. Before that, she was in Beijing. Alice was born in California, but grew up in Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Shanghai. And not only understands China extraordinarily well, speaks obviously fluent Mandarin, but she also speaks fluent Arabic and conversational Uyghur. And Alice is the only person I have ever hired who, her first request to me was, before I start, is it okay if I go and spend 6 weeks doing immersive Uyghur classes? To which I said, sure, go ahead. Welcome, Alice. And here to my immediate left and your right is Shashank Joshi, who is our defense editor, whom we prized away from the Royal United Services Institute, which you may know is one of the best defense think tanks in the world. I think before that you worked for Tony Blair. I'm glad we grabbed you away from him too. Shashank is, again, I think one of the best, if not the best, defense analyst in working in the media anywhere. Those of you who watch our Ukraine webinars will know that I certainly have learned more about military terminology and indeed about military matters from Shashank than anyone else. He's a font of knowledge, not just on the Ukraine war, but on defense policy globally, as you will see. So, with that introduction, I wanted to start, and we're going to rattle through various topics before we open to your question. The first is a kind of an assessment, actually, of how things look from where you are, because you have come from different parts of the world. So, David, start with you. I can't remember when you left Beijing, but it was just a matter of days ago. Give us a sense of the mood in Beijing, and what is the view of the US-China relationship from Beijing?
So I think one of the most extraordinary things about the mood in Beijing, and more broadly across China at the moment, is there's often a gulf between elite opinion and kind of mass opinion, but actually they're united right now in a crisis of confidence. And whether I'm out in the sticks talking to farmers or shopkeepers who are worried about the state of the economy, or I'm talking to kind of very, very well-known entrepreneurs or kind of top professors at elite universities, there is a sense that a lot of people had made their peace with the Chinese Communist Party based on the idea that they were technocrats who knew what they were doing. But whether it's because of the chaotic handling of the end of the pandemic, whether it's because of some of the own goals on economic policy, for those that actually follow these things closely enough, they have their issues with some of the foreign policies that we'll talk about later, like the close embrace of Vladimir Putin. There is this sense that, well, if we're not going to be free and they don't know what they're doing, then that's very concerning. And, people are very worried about, the numbers that we report about. The youth unemployment rate is now at record levels of 20%. That translates into endless conversations with ordinary Chinese about their kid who's just graduated from vocational school or from university and cannot get a graduate job. And then you have the party scolding them and saying, well, just get a job for the good of the sort of the motherland. So there's a sense of people are fed up. It's not revolution, they're fed up. In terms of the China-America debate, ordinary Chinese are much more likely to say the Americans are our enemy, and that's new, and that's not good, and that's partly propaganda. And then the elites have decided, as a kind of absolute consensus, that, as you heard in March, Zanny, that China is being contained, it's being choked, it's being held down in a kind of death match with a selfish, racist bully of an America that is unwilling to share the kind of the top table with China. And so that, whether it's entirely believed by everyone in the elite, has become the consensus, and I think we heard that in March. And that has policy consequences, because it means that those voices that used to argue that maybe the Americans might have a point on this or that, those voices now can't say that in public. It's not safe. And so there's a very dangerous consensus. And if the last couple of months we've seen a bit of an easing off in tensions, I think it's tactical. I think that fundamentally they have decided that this is a kind of contest which only one side can win.
And is there, do you think, a sense in Beijing that the country is sort of inexorably headed for confrontation, for military confrontation with the US?
The war drums are not beating loudly in Beijing, and that's one reason why I'm about to get on a plane back to Beijing. I mean, I love my job, but I'm not a kamikaze sort of reporter. If I thought there was going to be war immediately, I wouldn't go back. But I do think that there is a real sense. I think the thing that has changed, and I'll be quick, the thing that has changed is, when I was in America under, say, the Obama administration, or before that, the first time I was here, people welcomed China's rise with a kind of asterisk. As long as China rose peacefully and didn't completely disrupt the world order, then China was welcome to become as strong and as powerful and as wealthy as it liked. That was the Obama, Bush, Clinton kind of view. Now there is a sense in China, I don't think they're wholly wrong, that the welcome is also selective. That China is now so clearly seen as a threat by the US administration that their rise in AI or quantum in certain weapon systems that Shashank understands so well, that needs to be capped forever, that they must not rise in that. Do you remember that conversation we had in Beijing with a top scholar who used to be a security intelligence officer who said to us, we want to be a strong and powerful tiger. You want us to be a fat, neutered cat that only produces kind of safe, uncontroversial consumer goods. So if we want to grow an AI fang or a quantum fang, America wants to pull that out. Well, guess what? China doesn't want to be a neutered, fat cat. It wants to be a strong tiger. So there is a sense that if things are bad, and they surely are, it's because both sides now have openly, mutually incompatible ambitions for where this relationship goes.
I remember that conversation very well, not least because, A, you clearly were on such close terms with this former PLA official that he, like you, had a smart suit from Jermyn Street, which he was very proud to tell me was a smart suit from Jermyn Street. Alice, the view from Taipei, what's it like being in a place that is really at the cutting edge of great power confrontation? And secondly, tell us about your expectations for the election, which is what, in January in Taiwan, and what happens there?
So Taiwan has been, under the threat of Chinese invasion or Chinese takeover for the past 70 years, right? But I think it's only in the last few years, and in particular after the invasion of Ukraine, that ordinary people on the street in Taiwan have really begun to take that possibility seriously and to start to think, okay, like war, war could actually happen here. And I don't know how many of you guys have been to Taiwan, but when you're walking around on the streets, it's a highly developed country. It's filled with cafes, young people walking their dogs, people doing yoga in the park. It's not a place where you would think that you need to prepare for an invasion. But that is very much now becoming a part of the mainstream conversation. There is a presidential election approaching in January next year, and I can't overstate the importance of that election, because the president that the Taiwanese choose is going to be the person who will guide this island democracy through the next 4 years, a critical time in US-China relations, including the year 2027, which American intelligence says is the deadline for when Xi Jinping wants his military to be capable of invading Taiwan. I'm not saying that it's going to happen in 2027, but it's clearly a time when China is building up. And in this election, you basically have the two main parties. The ruling party is the Democratic Progressive Party, and they have been very much pushing they've been standing very firm on Taiwanese sovereignty. They've been emphasizing deterrence. They've been trying to push through reforms, extending conscription. But the problem is that because they reject the idea that Taiwan is part of China, they're not able to have dialogue with China. So right now, in the campaign in Taiwan, you hear the opposition party, the Kuomintang or the Nationalist Party, saying this vote is going to be a choice between war or peace. And what they're telling the Taiwanese people is, if you choose a party that continues to stand up for Taiwanese sovereignty, you're provoking China, you're gonna bring Chinese attack. And then what the DPP, the ruling party, is saying is, no, it's not a choice between war and peace, it's a choice between democracy or autocracy. And what they're implying is, if you vote for the other party, we're moving towards unification with China, we're moving towards losing our sovereignty. And for the Taiwanese voter, these are both unpalatable options, right? You don't want to be invaded like Ukraine, and you also don't want to lose your democratic freedoms like Hong Kong. So I think what's at stake here is these voters, they're going to need to decide, what kind of strategy they want, which way I guess Taiwan is going to lean, how much Taiwan is going to continue its strategy of deterrence. And I think it's going to be difficult if the DPP wins. Right now, they are ahead in the polls. So that is, again, the current ruling party that's more pro Taiwanese sovereignty. If they win, it's highly likely that China will respond with some sort of military aggression, not invasion, but some sort of gray zone activity, right? They've made it very clear that they don't want the DPP to win. Last year, after the Pelosi visit to Taiwan, we saw Chinese military exercise. Did you want to say something, Zanny? Sorry.
No, I was going to follow up, but
yeah.
Finish your thought.
Yes.
I was just going to say, so that's interesting. I didn't know that there is an expectation that if the DPP wins, there would be some kind of gray zone activity by China.
I think this is something that many people are worried about. We can't say it for sure, right? But this is what diplomats, unofficial diplomats, because most diplomats in Taiwan are unofficial diplomats, officials, experts are worried about. And I think it's fair to have that worry, because I think even if China doesn't do some sort of escalation right after the election, if the DPP wins, essentially we see a continuation of the same policy, which is to stand firm, to say Taiwan safeguards its sovereignty, does not need to declare independence because it's already independent. That's what President Tsai Ing-wen says, and needs to continue to prepare for war, to prevent war. And from the Chinese perspective, this is not good. And what China's trying to do is to wear down Taiwanese resolve. So we talk a lot about invasion. Sorry, do you want me to?
Yeah, if you just wrap up relatively soon, because I want to come to Shashank.
Okay, I'll say one more point, and then it will be a good lead into Shashank. But because we talk a lot about invasion, right? But what has been happening, especially over the last 8 years, is quite a lot of again, gray zone activity. So that's China sending its warplanes flying around Taiwan. That's China sending missiles going over Taiwan. It's daily activity that is not war, but that is constantly wearing down Taiwan's defenses. It's exhausting Taiwan's military, and that's combined with a lot of what we call cognitive warfare. So disinformation, propaganda from China saying, Taiwan is weak, Taiwan will never win. Also, Taiwan is being used by America, just like Ukraine is being used by America. Ukraine is being sacrificed by the US in order to weaken Russia. And in the same way, China is going to sacrifice Taiwan to weaken China. So don't be used by America. That's the kind of propaganda and information that China is trying to push, and they're trying to weaken Taiwanese public opinion. They're trying to make the Taiwanese feel isolated, and that's going to continue.
Wow. Okay, well, against that backdrop, Shashank, give us your military assessment. What is the likelihood of military conflict, and how would it unfold? I mean, I'm a bit sobered by what Alice has just told us.
I think the thing to start with is the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, has made astonishing strides. Just to give you one small sense of this, last year, I think the People's Liberation Army Navy commissioned around 22 new ships. That's bigger than the entire Royal Navy. In 1 year, that's what they're churning out. And they are doing things today that they would not have been able to do 5 or 6 years ago. Those aerial incursions that you talked about, those are occurring in formations of a number of planes together that the PLA Air Force wouldn't have been able to do 5 or 6 years ago. However, I think this is the critical part, and I'll strike a slightly less gloomy note than my colleagues here. Xi Jinping knows his army is not ready. He understands the deficiencies, the defects. He understands the problems around big, complex amphibious operations. He knows he has domestic aircraft carriers, but actually, has he mastered the art of having destroyers and frigates around them to protect them? Has he mastered the art of submarine operations to clear a path for their progress, of air and naval operations jointly? All of these things that the US has been doing since Midway, almost continuously, a lot of it's new for the Chinese, and they will take time, and Xi knows it. The officials who are tasked with assessing this and are answering that question think of this in terms of a window of opportunity or vulnerability. And if you're China, you're not ready now. However, if you go to 2035, say, you also know that things will be different. To give you one example, you may have 8 nuclear-powered Australian attack submarines patrolling the South China Sea in stealthy fashion, capable of making life absolutely hell for any sort of invasion force. So what that means is you may have a relatively narrow window at some point at the end of this decade, in the early 2030s, when the conditions for invasion may be better than they are now and better than they will be later. However, I am still skeptical that that means it is likely that China will invade. I still think the probability is considerably less than 50%. I don't think we should get sucked into the sort of fatalistic idea it will happen. And of course, as I think Alice pointed out very importantly, the far likelier scenarios are those short of invasion, one of which was foreshadowed or previewed after the Pelosi visit, which is a naval blockade of the island, which could strangulate Taiwan. It could put the onus of escalation onto the US and allies to break the blockade, and it could be very effective. And I think that's a far more serious and possible scenario.
Which takes us to a second topic I wanted to talk about, which is what has been the impact of Russia's invasion of Ukraine on not just the Chinese calculus and indeed the Taiwanese perception, but on the relationships between China and Russia, because it's been a sort of the worsening of the US-China relationship has been ongoing for several years. Then comes this other very dramatic shock. So David, for you first, tell us what the impact of that invasion has been on Beijing's thinking, and particularly its relationship with Russia.
I think it's been very large, but it's worked in 2 different ways. So I think it's confirmed many of China's, frankly, fairly bleak views about how the world works, and that has pulled them closer to Russia, but it's had a devastating impact on their relations with people like the Europeans. So to start with China and Russia and that bleak worldview, for a Chaguan column, but also for an episode of Drum Tower, one of the most extraordinary places I've been in the last kind of year or two was right up on the Russia-China border. And I went up in January, so it was minus, a gazillion or whatever. You have to take a sort of sleeper train overnight and get there. And they have a museum on the Chinese side to a massacre by Russian Tsarist imperialist troops, where they massacred thousands of Chinese peasants to grab at the beginning of a huge slew of Chinese territory that was taken at the end of the Chinese Empire when it was weak. And various foreign countries were grabbing bits of territory, including enormous tracts of basically Siberia taken by the Russians. And I went to this museum because I had heard a rumor that as a foreigner I could go as long as I wasn't Russian. And so when I got there and I showed them my British passport, they were kind of, oh my God, a foreigner. And I said, is it true that a Russian can't come in? And they're like, yes. And then there's this absolutely vast diorama painting, kind of sort of about 90 feet long, of Russian Tsarist troops burning, raping, pillaging, bayoneting children, the whole 9 yards. And then at the end of this museum about the wickedness of the Russians and the depredations, there's a big bronze plaque about the lessons that the Chinese visitors should draw from this museum. And it says, don't hate the Russians, don't have bitterness from history, but remember one lesson above all. 落后就要挨打, which is, if you are weak and backwards, you will be beaten and bullied. And that is the lesson they want you to learn. So you then talk to the local Chinese, who live hard on the border with the Russians, and their view of the Ukraine war is that a smaller country like Ukraine, if it's weaker, of course it's going to be beaten and bullied by Russia. That's the way the world works. You'd have to be a baby to think anything different. And so if Ukraine is now being defended by the Americans or by the Europeans, it cannot possibly be because they believe there's a moral case. It's just that this is a bleak kind of mafia boss world of might makes right. And if a large country is attacking a small country and the small country is resisting, it can only be because it's a pawn of another great power that is playing geopolitical games. So the entirety of Chinese public opinion thinks that this war was caused by NATO, caused by America, is Ukraine, they are pawns in a great power conflict. And this is reinforced enormously by by Chinese propaganda. Now, I can tell you that in Beijing, talking to European ambassadors, they have gone from tremendous naivety, China could be the perfect peace broker in this, to deep shock at the cold level with which, for Chinese officials, for Chinese diplomats, for Chinese scholars, for the propaganda machine, the suffering of the Ukrainian people is an irrelevance. This is chess. It is great power chess, and has had an extraordinary impact on views of China.
But in that game of chess, it is notable to me that before the invasion, David, you recall the big Sino-Russian joint statement, a partnership without limits, and it really had a profound impact in European capitals. I remember I was at the NATO summit in Madrid in summer of 22, and that statement, the initial fears that China was really in lockstep with the Russians, completely reshaped that summit and made them talk about the China-Russia partnership in their big strategic concept. Go forward a little bit, and I think that's changed. We've seen some of the limits of it as well, the constraints. And so from a military perspective, the most notable thing is that despite being asked, the Chinese did not supply the Russians with what they needed the most in the world last year, which was artillery ammunition. Did they get any? No. And I think that's really striking as well.
I was struck, David, remember when I was in Beijing in March this year, I spoke at a security conference and I was talking about having been in Ukraine and the plight of Ukraine and sort of describing what it was like. And I remember there was kind of complete silence in the room. They literally didn't even think that Ukraine and what it mattered to Ukraine was really a subject of any great relevance. And the entire, and this was at a foreign policy elite discussion, was about a defeat for Russia would be bad for China. And that was the prism through which it was seen. Alice, very briefly, in Taipei, you mentioned it earlier, but after the invasion of Ukraine, has it made people more determined to resist or more worried?
I think it's raised determination to not be Ukraine, which is troubling because when you talk to Taiwanese government officials, they say two big takeaways that Taiwan got right away from the Ukraine war. One is that a small country can resist. Actually, a small country with a large authoritarian neighbor that doesn't believe it should exist, they can actually fight back. They can actually they don't have to be, taken over right away, because that's I think what a lot of perhaps people thought would happen with Ukraine. But then the second thing is, if a small country wants to have support from the rest of the world, it has to show that it's willing to fight for itself. And basically, for the Taiwanese government, they realized, if, God forbid, that day should ever come that China tries to make a move on Taiwan, we have to show that the Taiwanese will fight. We have to fight for ourselves, and only when we fight for ourselves, then the rest of the world, can step in and can support us. And I think the problem and the great concern for Taiwanese officials is whether the public is on board with that. And I think there's this kind of difficult, how do you say, difficult loop here where the Taiwanese public is afraid of war, understandably, like any public would be. And when you look at public opinion polls after the invasion of Ukraine, one big thing that dropped was Taiwanese confidence in whether America would come to its defense. Even though, of course, the US is supporting Ukraine, funding Ukraine, of course, there are no boots on the ground, and it's unreasonable to expect that. But for the Taiwanese, it was a big fear. And I think they're watching very closely to see how strong Western support is for Ukraine. And if it drops, that's going to impact Taiwanese confidence. And in some ways, Taiwanese confidence is predicated on their belief that there are other countries, other friends in the world who will come and stand by them, and they can never be 100% sure, because that's part of the way Taiwan security works, is you have to keep it ambiguous. You can't say, but it's kind of like a mind game that's going on.
It was one of the things. I remember just prior to the invasion of Ukraine, at the Munich Security Conference, I was on moderating some panel, and David Petraeus, General Petraeus, said. He may be here, I don't know. He said, the real question is, will they fight? And that was the big surprise, or the big shock, and not so much shock, but the realization, the Ukrainian determination was, I think, part of what galvanized the West. And I think that's a really interesting question in Taiwan and for Taiwan. Would there be a similar kind of reaction? In the interest of time, which is running on, let's turn to the third topic, which is how all of this is reshaping global geopolitics. And David, I want to start with you. I mean, China is, I'm going to put this very simplistically because that's what journalists do, but China is trying to shape a new world order that is more, hospitable to autocracies, that doesn't care about pesky things like values and freedom. Tell us what it's trying to do.
So there's a whole bunch of straw men around this. I'll often hear from people, China isn't trying to, make everyone study Xi Jinping thought around the whole world. It's not actually trying to replace the current rules-based order. And certainly the Chinese would say that they are defenders of the rules-based order against the awful rule-breaking Americans, for example. I think that if you actually read what they're saying, if you speak to Chinese officials and scholars, and you watch what they're doing in places like the United Nations, what they're trying to do is actually very subtle, certainly much more subtle than Russia, which basically is kind of just a wrecker. The Chinese are trying to have half the current rules-based order. Because if you think back to kind of the origins of, say, the UN in 1945, there was a balance between the sovereignty and absolute kind of deference to sovereign governments and states versus individual rights. And in 1945, the Soviets tried to make it much more deferential to states, but they lost. They didn't have the numbers. So America and its allies basically imposed a world in which states' rights were balanced against individual rights. China wants to have that fight again, because they think that the numbers this time are on their side. And so what they want is a rules-based order. I mean, it's not a phrase I'd probably use in a column because you probably wouldn't like it, but it's like a zombie rules-based order where the words are the same: democracy, human rights, all of these words are still used, but they don't mean anything. They don't get to bind China in any way. And so I think that what they're trying to do is actually an extraordinarily dangerous operation. And the final straw man is, but China wasn't at the table in 1945, at least the communist China was not. And so how can we object to them wanting to have a say in rewriting the rules for the rules-based order now? They're much bigger, they're much more strong. Of course they have a right. Of course they're going to be at the top table. It's just that as liberals who believe in universal values at The Economist, we want them to lose. So they have every right to compete, but we don't want them to succeed, because what they're pushing right now, very, very cleverly, when they look at, for example, resentment of the Ukraine war and the moral arguments in the global South, Africans saying, well, actually, we just care about very expensive food, which seems to be because you're sanctioning Russia. The Chinese basically say that universal values, human rights, all of this is Western arrogance and colonialism trying to sort of impose one model and is disrespectful of the diversity of different political systems and definitions of human rights. You boil it down, and what they're really trying to say is that universal values are racist. And so for the Americans, the great challenge for America and others and for The Economist is to compete. It's a competition, it's on, and we have to say, no, it's not that universal values, defending human rights is not like telling someone what gods to pray to. It's about clean water. Clean governance is like clean water. Everyone should have it. But we're in a fight from first principles, trying to refight those fights of 1945. And China has a plan to outnumber the defenders of the liberal order.
I think that's the most striking thing that's come through from your reporting. And you were very early on this, and you wrote a special report more than 2 years ago laying this out. And I, at the time, thought, David's always downbeat about everything, but you were actually spot on. And it's a plan. It's a very clear view of where China wants to get to. Alice, from you briefly, do you think it's succeeding? I mean, you're based in Taipei, but you spend a lot of time looking at what is going on in the rest of Asia. Do you think this approach that China is trying to develop is finding adherence, is finding success?
Mm-hmm. Well, first, I just have to make a quick point, building on David's idea about China's argument that universal values are racist. To clarify that, it's also saying basically if Chinese people say that they believe in values like democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, things like that, they can't. Basically they're under Western influence. That is a Western thing. That is not a Chinese thing, and it's implying that. And that's what you see also under Xi Jinping in the last 10 years within China. When you see Chinese civil society fighting for things like equal rights, you see human rights lawyers trying to speak up for the oppressed and the marginalized, then the state labels them as people under the influence of hostile foreign forces trying to incite subversion of state power, and that's just not true. So I just wanted to clarify that. And I think Taiwan as a place that is majority ethnic Chinese and really values traditional Chinese culture, but also embraces democracy at the same time, it is a counterpoint to that argument, to the idea that Chinese people can only be, Confucian and submissive and, embracing hierarchy and authoritarianism. That's Taiwan itself. It's just its existence challenges that, and that's another reason why I think the Communist Party would like to see the Taiwan system merged into its own. And then on the question of how successful is this approach, I mean I think that actually a lot of what we call middle powers, I guess, in the world that are run by governments that are not democratic, they quite like this idea that here comes a new superpower that has a lot of clout, has a lot of funding, has a lot of capacity to come and make deals with you, help you develop, and says, hey, we can do this for you, and you don't have to change your system. You can keep oppressing dissidents, you can keep arresting whoever you want, and we can band together. And actually, if you join us, we will be the majority at the UN, and we will be the majority of the world. And really, it's only a small minority of those, those colonial Westerners who are still who did all these bad things to you. Fairly, they did.
And if you need surveillance cameras to catch those dissidents,
we will give them to you. We'll give you a good deal. We'll teach you how to use them. I think that does appeal actually to quite a lot of governments around the world. So we are seeing that, and we see that. I think we do see a big shift also in recent years, where in the past it was China was doing a lot of, say, China had this Belt and Road Initiative where they were doing development financing around the world, and oftentimes China's big stance in the past was non-interference. So we won't impose a system on anybody else the way that America does. Like, we won't force anyone else to democratize. We'll just help you make money. Like, isn't that great? That's what everybody wants. But now these days we are seeing much more normative initiatives coming out from China. These global civilization initiative, global security initiative, global development initiative, and they sound very fuzzy. They're hard to understand, but essentially what the Communist Party is saying is, Western civilization and modernization is not the only way, and that's true, but they're also saying, if you want to modernize and become civilized in a way that doesn't value individual rights, like it's great. We do it like we did, and we can teach you how to do it. and that's very appealing.
Appealing to autocratic governments.
To autocratic governments, yes.
Just before, you two are digging me into deep depression here, so just...
Sorry, yeah.
Shashank, I think he's probably going to do this too, but I do want to hear from you about what the military analog of this is. Because if we have a creation of this kind of alternative world order that we've just heard eloquently from Alice and David, what's the military analog of the multipolar world?
I think the military analog is that if you think of the world order of the 90s as being one that was subject to ordering by America, you know, Kuwait has invaded America and its allies can reverse it. It's pretty straightforward in that sense. That becomes extremely hard because lots of these countries have alternatives. There are many more permutations they can turn to of Russia and China. In some cases, if you're a Central Asian government looking for legitimacy for your bogus election, you could have election observers from the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or the CSTO or someone else to give your bogus poll a stamp of authority. We also see diplomatic alternatives in the Middle East. You know, we've just had a major Saudi Arabian, Iranian modus vivendi, a deal brokered by China. You know, it's a deal that will reflect Chinese priorities. And more broadly than that, on you know, thinking of sort of crises or nuclear proliferation, for instance, if you're a would-be proliferator, you know, Iran or those who may follow in its wake, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, others, if you have an alternative source of nuclear energy, enrichment, fissile material, votes at the UN. You have a Security Council member who is willing to give you diplomatic cover for your program. A world in which the US-China relationship has broken down, and a world in which you see that kind of multipolar reordering is one in which the US and its allies simply have less clout. And I think we see this today in the form of Ukraine sanctions, which are profoundly less effective than they would have been 15 or 20 years ago. And we are living with the consequences of that every single day.
Okay, I knew you'd depress me more. You really have done. Thank you. I'm going to turn to these in just a second, but one quick subject before we turn to your questions, which is we've just laid out rather gloomily, I think, where the world is going outside the US. So let's talk about the US itself and the impact. No, it's important, right? The impact of 2024 and how, particularly from the rest of the world, this is seen. So, David, you've just spent a week, I think, in Washington, your first trip there since you were in Beijing. Give us a sense of two things. First of all, how deep the kind of bipartisan consensus of being tough on China is. Where's that going to go? And is the approach that the US is taking, de-risking, decoupling, whatever you want to call it, likely to be effective? And very briefly, do this in about 2 minutes, also tell me who the Chinese want to win in 24.
So there is a broad bipartisan consensus, which is very striking, having come back after 4 years away, that China is a threat, that China is hostile. There is no more kind of, you know, basically the kind of the naivety voices or even kind of engagement voices have been stilled. Now, of course, it will come as no surprise to anyone here that, like everything else, China policy is not insulated from bipartisan, from partisan calculation and political dysfunction. So it was really striking when you ask I was talking to people, you know, Republicans would immediately say, well, of course, on climate change, we break with the Democrats. You know, the stupid Democrats are trying to make everyone buy electric cars, to take away our gas-powered trucks. And that's going to leave us, you know, exposed to the Chinese who make these battery-powered cars. And so, you know, that's a kind of an example of how domestically kind of potent arguments are getting a kind of China fitting to them. De-risking and decoupling. So decoupling is one of these straw men, again, that people say, oh, we can't decouple from China. No one's about to decouple from China. Of course we can't. The US does $2 billion of trade, two-way trade with China every single day of the year. It's just an absolutely gigantic trade. Now, de-risking is a perfectly sensible middle path, which is basically if you don't trust the person you're doing business with, you have to do due diligence. You have to do risk management. The problem is that China, under Xi Jinping, has no intention of being de-risked. You want to audit your supply chain to see if there's forced labor, he'll lock up your auditors. If you want to try and get less dependent on China for critical minerals, he has given speeches in which he says it's actually in China's strong interest to keep us dependent on critical minerals, while China strives to become self-reliant and not dependent on us. So then the question that you ask, a very good question, which is the parlor game at every ambassador's dinner I attend in Beijing, who do the Chinese want to win the election in 2024? I think there were kind of three Trumps as far as China was concerned. There was a transactional Trump who was willing to kind of, do deals for soybeans and stuff. Then there was the kind of post-pandemic Trump who blamed the Chinese. There was the Trump who almost attacked North Korea and then pulled back after fire and fury. They don't know which Trump they would get. So the Trump that they loved was the one who was going to destroy the West, who was going to do transactional deals. There was a meme, do you remember Alice Chan Jianguo? That figure who was like, build up the country Trump, sometimes in a Red Army uniform. And they weren't talking about America. The country he was going to build up was China because he was such a rubbish president. That one, from the Chinese perspective, they'd take. But if it was the fire and fury, potentially destabilizing, unpredictable military Trump, that one scares them. So there is an argument that a weak, old Biden could also do them just fine. But I can tell you that the dysfunctional American politics, every Republican, maybe Democrat too, to be fair, member of Congress who suggests that democracy is a fraud in America, that the fix is in, that this is not a true democracy, they might as well write it's an in-kind campaign contribution to the Chinese Communist propaganda machine, because it goes straight onto Chinese state TV.
Really? Okay, these are terrific questions. So I'm actually going to not hear, we'll come back at the end about what's going to happen in 24 from your perspective in Taipei and Shashank yours. But these are great questions. And Shashank, a lot of them are for you. So there's a bit of rapid fire here. Where does India fit in politically and economically?
Well, India's relationship with China has obviously suffered grievously since 2020 when the border dispute flared up. Some of you may recall the Galwan dispute a couple of years ago, which was the incredibly deadly clash of these two armies because their border agreements precluded them carrying arms with ammunition. We had the grotesque spectacle of PLA and Indian Army soldiers fighting each other with maces, clubs wrapped with barbed wire and machetes. And that relationship, I think, is not going to recover. I think it's permanently changed, and the border is permanently militarized. The consequence of that, of course, is an Indian relationship with the US and also with Australia, Japan, others, to balance Chinese power in an incredibly far-reaching way that we would have thought outlandish 10 years ago. But the last thing I'll say on this is, for the Indians, they are mindful of that conversation we've just had of 2024 and what it means for them, and they are hedging as well, and they know that they have to keep one foot on the side that says, let's stabilize this relationship. We know we are weak relative to China. We don't know how long the Americans will stand with us. And that's always a constant restraint in Indian policy on that question.
So the not having to have one foot on the other side just in case you can't rely on the Americans.
Absolutely. And they, of course, know that they are a tiny fraction of the Chinese defense budget.
So we have a bunch of military experts or people who are, I think we're testing you here, Shashank. I said you were brilliant, so right, here we go. Russian and Chinese theorists believe that information superiority will be crucial for kinetic operations at the future of war. Do you agree?
Yes, but we have to. I think we have to, de-jargonize that, because what it really means is if President Zelensky has access to the internet and he can tweet and he can record a cell phone video that shows he's alive, then the people will rally behind him. That's what information warfare is, and the PLA's vision of it is to say, don't let the leader do that. If you invade Taiwan, then make sure you decapitate the leadership, or at the very least, you silence them. And that's a core part of what information warfare is. It's other things too, jamming and stopping communications and all these things. But really, it's about stopping the national leadership communicate.
One more, this is quite technical. Forward deployed nuclear fast attack boats, brackets submarines, will determine the outcome of an invasion of Taiwan. Will China preemptively strike Okinawa, Diego Garcia, or Japan?
Well, those are two different questions. I think submarines are going to be very important, but don't forget they take a long time to get where they need to be. Sailing times are long, and there aren't all that many. So I don't think submarines are the decisive factor in a Taiwan campaign. I think the decisive factor is really whether the US chooses to strike the Chinese mainland, particularly Chinese air defenses on the mainland. But on the question of strikes, I think nobody really knows, but there is a profoundly strong temptation for the Chinese to do so in order to keep America out of the fight. But of course, if they do that, then it vastly increases the probability that the US does intervene in force. So I think despite the temptations of the sucker punch, the effort to try and take the Americans out, take off their bases in Okinawa, in other places, I think on balance, and for some of the reasons I outlined earlier to do with a blockade being a favoured option, that the balance of interest probably lies against an early strike on American facilities.
That's interesting. Alice, I'm going to give Shashank a bit of a breather. This one is for you, and I'm going to add to it the question about 2024 and Taiwan's view on that. Do you think the relationship between China and the US is better under the current or the former administration, and why?
Between China and the US?
Yes. Is it better under the
American
Biden administration or the Trump administration, and why?
Is it better?
You can take better to be, well, I guess our questioner is here, so could tell us what they mean by better, but how is it, has it got worse under the Biden administration? I mean, one argument might be that the Biden administration has continued the policy of the Trump administration, but just rather more effectively.
Yeah, I think it has not improved. It has, I think tensions have risen. Has it become, I think, how do I say this? The US-China relationship has gotten more tense, but that I think is also because of the trajectory of the two countries, not necessarily because it was Trump versus Biden. I think it's gotten more tense, but a little bit more predictable. Because the biggest difference, I think, when you look at the Trump and the Biden administration, okay, both were harsh on China, but Biden, he said very clearly what he was going to do, and then he did it. He said, we're going to build alliances, we're going to bring America back onto the global stage, we're going to, build up deterrence and defense with our partners. We have AUKUS, we have the Quad, we're going to Japan, and he is still he's very much continuing America's stance in terms of shifting towards competition with China, in terms of recognizing China is a threat, but it's happening in a methodical, clear, and predictable way. And I think that is very reassuring for allies, for Taiwan, and I think also for many other countries in the region. The Trump administration was harsh on China, but in an erratic and kind of unpredictable way, and that's something we really felt actually as journalists on the ground, because I was in China during the Trump administration, and I was at that time working for an American news outlet, and many U.S. journalists were expelled from China in a kind of tit-for-tat move when the Trump administration put restrictions on Chinese news staff in America. And there was this feeling when I was working as a U.S. journalist in China under Trump that you never knew we never knew what our government might do at home that might result in some sort of retaliation on us in China. And so I think under the Biden administration, there's been less of that sense of total unpredictability.
And can I just add the question that I asked David, which is how are people in Taipei viewing 24 and the stakes of the US election in 24?
I think if you ask any Taiwanese official, they will not give you an answer on the record ever. They will say, as America always says about Taiwan, it's a democracy and they can choose, and we support whatever they choose. But I do think that aside from what they say on the record, I think in general the Taiwanese want predictability and stability, and they want above all to keep the status quo, which is peace. They want the status quo, which is de facto independence, where they get to continue living their lives and to minimize the risk of conflict. So whoever can assure them that they will try to keep things stable, that's who they want, and that applies, I think, actually in terms of their own election as well.
Thank you. Gosh, you are impressive. We've got 7 minutes and about 20 questions. Right. Shashank, this one's for you. Do Japan and South Korea each need their own nuclear weapons and their own delivery systems?
These are obviously live debates in these countries, much less so in Japan, much more so in South Korea, where conservative politicians have for many years been calling for this, particularly as North Korea's. The fundamental dynamic, Zanny, as we've written, is that as North Korea has acquired reliable nuclear weapons with reliable delivery systems that can reach the continental United States, however much American leaders pretend otherwise, the South Koreans can see this. And they face the same dilemma that Charles de Gaulle identified in the 50s, which is to say, will the Americans really trade San Francisco for Paris? Will they trade an American city for a European city? The South Koreans today see the same problem. They identify the same problem, that it was easy for America to extend a nuclear umbrella over South Korea when the North Koreans couldn't reach it. And now it's a completely different proposition. So that sparked that debate and accelerated it. But they know, as do the Japanese and as do, I think, others, that seeking a nuclear program in this day and age would mean forfeiting US conventional protection. And I think that would be a profoundly reckless step for South Korea to take, which is why I think it's exceedingly unlikely at this stage.
Switching gears slightly, there are several economic questions about China. So David, I'm going to give these to you, and I'm going to give you two at the same time. One is there any chance that China's economy will duplicate what Japan's did in the 1990s, i.e. debt-laden sluggishness for decades? And secondly, what effect is the economic and geopolitical unease in China having on foreign, i.e. American, companies there?
They're both excellent questions. So there clearly is the potential for a Japanese style. I mean, there'd be differences, but you've got an aging population, you've got a real estate bubble. There are, our colleagues who are very smart economic analysts, they've written about some significant differences. But I can tell you that, as a political journalist, the political importance of the fact that the most important savings vehicle for Chinese households for the last 20, 30 years has been housing. It was seen as the one safe, reliable, essentially state-backed form of investment that could not go down, that could not suffer. If that starts to slide or really collapse, then that is a kind of a breach of an unwritten social compact with the Communist Party that I think would be extraordinarily serious. And I think when I said at the very beginning that there's a crisis of confidence among the elites and ordinary people in China, that is extraordinarily closely bound up with people worrying about these investments that their entire future is made in. The mood among multinationals, it really depends on the sector you're talking to. There are still some sectors where China is the growth story. Some big chemicals companies, some kind of electronics companies like Apple that are just so massively embedded in the Chinese economy that they cannot easily disentangle themselves. They're trying to put a brave face on it. But I can also tell you that when they lock up American bankers, when they exit ban American lawyers, or they lock up due diligence auditors, it's not great for morale. I mean, in Beijing, we get used to people getting locked up and then you adjust no, the number of foreign deals being done now that are kind of future-facing is dramatically down.
I was saying to you before we went on stage that I increasingly come across not just American, but foreign CEOs and foreign officials or corporate types who will no longer go to China, who are concerned, worried about actually going there. These questions are fantastic, by the way. They're really, really excellent. This is one for you, David.
Economist subscribers, Zanny. What do we expect?
Yeah, but even by the standards of Economist subscribers, these are very good. How likely do you think the chance of a Russo-Sino war over Outer Manchuria and Siberia before a war with Taiwan? David?
Very low.
Very low. Okay.
Zero.
Zero?
Yeah.
I don't think you should ever say zero or something like that, but okay, very low.
Near zero. Near zero.
You can put the same question to our Russia editor afterwards when you accost him.
Yes, over to our Russia editor, Arkady Ostrowski, is indeed in the audience. He's going to. We've got a lot of Ukraine, so I'm going to give one to you at the end. But briefly, Alice, to you, this one. Is Taiwan willing and able to destroy strategic chip manufacturing facilities if the mainland China attempts to take over control of the island?
I think definitely not. Is Taiwan willing to destroy its own chip facilities if China wants to take control of the island? No, they're not. And I think, should I expand on it?
Very briefly, because I want to get one in for
Okay. I mean, chips are not the reason why China wants to take Taiwan. China wants to take Taiwan for historical reasons, for political reasons. Chips are important to Taiwan because they make Taiwan important to the rest of the world, because every single one of you is using chips in your devices that were made in Taiwan. So the semiconductor industry is immensely important to Taiwan, but they also realize that if China was going to attack, it wouldn't matter if it wouldn't matter if the TSMC fabs were working or not. China would be making a calculation based on other factors. So I don't think they would destroy them.
That's very clear. Thank you. There are some fabulous questions on Ukraine here, but we have not got time to go too detailed into Ukraine. I just would urge those of you who want to know about Ukraine to watch, either rush to Washington for tomorrow's event or watch it online, because it will be very focused on Ukraine. In our last couple of minutes, I'm going to ask each of you, because I want to end on a slightly more upbeat note. I feel like we've just filled you with gloom. So I want you to think about, if you were in the White House, and please don't take any job there, but if you were in the White House, what would be top of your list of priorities for ensuring that this relationship does not end in conflict? Shashank, let's start with you.
This is a little tangential, but it's arms control. It's the idea of something we haven't discussed in a US-China context, but worries me, which is nuclear arms racing. China's nuclear arsenal is growing at a phenomenal pace. It could sort of triple over the next 10 years, and it will really upset every other nuclear relationship. It will upset India, which will then upset Pakistan. It will upset the US-Russia balance, because it will make it more difficult for those two to have arms control. So if I was in the White House, I would think not necessarily about old-fashioned Cold War style, New START treaty caps on numbers, but a dialogue in which the US and China both just seek to understand how each side views the use of nuclear weapons. Because I can tell you from lots of studies, lots of research, they don't understand how the other side thinks about the use of nuclear weapons, and that's a very dangerous thing.
And part of the problem right now is that the Chinese side is not very keen to have that dialogue, right?
The Chinese side says, well, you in Russia have vast numbers of nuclear weapons. If you want us to get in, on arms control, call us when you've gone down to our size, and then we'll talk.
Alice, if you were in the White House, what would be top of your list of priorities?
I think the top has to be continuing deterrence. I think increasing military cooperation with Taiwan and helping train the Taiwanese to fight in a way that will be compatible with the US. But then at the same time, I think also more of an emphasis on economic engagement in the Indo-Pacific and the East Asia region. I didn't get to answer one question earlier about other countries in the region, do they have to pick a side? And I think for a long time there's been this conventional wisdom that in East Asia, and now in the Pacific, whatever you want to call it, many countries rely on the US for security and on China for economic growth and for economic prosperity. And now, the US is leaning very heavily on the security side, but when I go around Asia and talk to officials, they constantly bring up, do you remember the TPP? We wish, what Asian countries want is access to American markets and more economic engagement, and I think that's something that would really strengthen the relationships in that area.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If only there were more people listening to that. That's something we've been writing about for years. It was a grave mistake to leave the TPP, and it's a grave mistake not to offer more market access. David, the last word is yours. Please don't leave us too depressed, but if you were in the White House, what would your top priority be?
So I would endorse their top priorities too. So mine is intended to be a compliment. Remember that bronze plaque in that museum on the Russian border that said, "The weak get beaten." So China's never going to love the United States under the Communist Party leadership. But if America is strong, then they will fear beating America. And that's not just about military strength, Shashank's world. It's also about America being its best self. And, maybe because it's my first time back in 4 years, Zanny, I have not lived here as long as you have, but 9 years of my life living in America. Both my kids born in Washington, D.C. This country at its best is magnanimous, it's generous, it's open to immigration. The American dream is open to others to join it. You can become an American and join the top team. China's Communist Party, the Chinese dream is not open to others. It's a Chinese ethno-nationalist, closed, inward-looking dream. It is not magnanimous. And so China has every right to compete, but it's a competition that America, the best of America, remember that Bill Clinton phrase about there's nothing wrong with America that can't be put right with what's right with America. And I don't underestimate for a second the grave challenges that American politics currently faces. But the America that I have grown up loving, that my family loves, the best of that America can compete with China and be strong in ways that the rest of the world will recognize as superior to this narrow, ethno-nationalist, values-free, might makes right Chinese project. But America has to get it right and be its best self.
That seems an appropriate place to end. Thank you all very much.